I was pouring coffee when my husband told his business partners I wasn't even close to his level. 3 years of marriage collapsed into that single sentence, spoken casually, while I stood invisible in our conference room, holding a silver carafe worth more than most people rent. If you've ever felt erased in your own life, subscribe now, because what happened next changed everything. The porcelain cups clinked softly as I collected them, each sound marking my irrelevance. Brandon's voice carried that tone he used for impressing people, the one making my spine stiffen before processing his actual words. His partners, Richard Morrison and James Caldwell, laughed in that knowing way men share when complicit in someone's diminishment. Brandon's expensive cologne mixed with coffee steam, and I remember noticing these details with strange clarity in the moment before everything shifted. 3 years earlier, I had walked away from everything I'd built. Before Brandon Ashford, before this beautiful prison in Seattle's wealthiest neighborhood, I was Claire Mercer. I had created and sold 2 technology startups by age 29. The first, a data analytics platform for small businesses, sold for $340,000. The second, cloud-based inventory management, brought $670,000. I held an MBA in finance from Northwestern, connections throughout tech, and reputation for seeing patterns others missed. Then I met Brandon at a venture capital event in Portland. He made my ambitions feel expandable, talked about building empires together, promised my business skills combined with his sales expertise would create something unprecedented. 6 months later, we married. 8 months after that, I had dissolved my consulting practice and transferred my entire savings into our joint account so Brandon could launch his commercial real estate software company. He promised we were building our future together, that my name would appear on everything alongside his. I believed him because I wanted someone who finally saw me as partner rather than competition. Standing in that conference room collecting cups like hired help while my husband casually erased my existence, something shifted inside my chest. No drama, no tears, just strange, cold clarity, like fluorescent lights suddenly illuminating a room where I'd been stumbling in darkness for years. My hands stayed steady. My breathing remained even. I simply understood, with crystalline precision, that I had catastrophically miscalculated who Brandon actually was beneath charm and promises. For 2 years, I had been systematically erased. At corporate parties, Brandon introduced me as just my wife, while elaborating on everyone else's accomplishments. When former colleagues asked about my career, he interrupted with comments about how I had decided to focus on simpler things now, his voice dripping condescension disguised as affection. His mother Helen cornered me at her birthday dinner last spring, suggesting I had so much free time and should consider volunteer work to stay occupied. Brandon nodded along, adding that I needed purpose. I stood there in Helen's immaculate dining room, surrounded by crystal and silverware probably worth more than my first car, while my husband and mother-in-law discussed my empty life as if I weren't present. Christmas brought the ultimate insult. While Brandon's brother received latest technology and his sister got expensive jewelry, I unwrapped books about gardening and gourmet cooking. The message was unmistakable. This was who they decided I was now, the decorative wife, the woman with nothing better than tending plants and preparing elaborate meals. Each interaction, each dismissal, each casual cruelty had been building something inside me that I didn't fully recognize yet, but it was accumulating like pressure behind a dam. That morning in the conference room, I finished collecting cups and walked out without a word. Brandon didn't notice. I could hear him launching into quarterly projections, voice full of manufactured confidence he wore for investors. I carried the tray to the kitchen, rinsed each cup carefully, placed them in the dishwasher with the same methodical attention I gave everything in this house. Then I walked upstairs to Brandon's home office, the room he claimed as exclusive domain, and started looking through papers scattered across his mahogany desk. I wasn't snooping exactly. Or maybe I was. All I knew was something had broken open inside me, and I needed understanding of what my life had become. The office was massive, all dark wood and leather furniture screaming old money and masculine authority. Brandon had chosen every piece himself, forbidding me from adding anything he called too feminine or soft. Shelves held business books he'd never read, arranged by color rather than content, because that looked better on camera. His desk stayed scattered with papers in that. Specific organized chaos men think makes them look important and busy. I started with the printer, that massive machine he'd insisted on despite my suggesting something smaller and more efficient. The paper tray was full, and there on top sat a document he had clearly printed and forgotten. I picked it up more from habit than curiosity. It was legal documentation, dense with terminology I recognized from my own business dealings. As I read the first page, my heart started beating faster. This was a prenuptial agreement amendment dated 2 weeks ago that I had never seen or discussed. I flipped through pages, hands definitely shaking now, breath coming shallow and quick. The clauses were devastating. Complete exclusion from any ownership or participation in Brandon's company. Specific language stating any financial contributions I made were considered gifts rather than investments. Detailed provisions ensuring I would receive minimal support in divorce. And there, at the bottom of page 7, was the signature of the attorney who drafted this revision, Thomas Whitmore, Esquire. I knew that name. My brain raced, pulling up memories from 4 years ago. Thomas had been my attorney during my second startup sale. Esse capítulo de 900 palavras ficou bom para você? Quer que eu siga para o próximo? Tentar novamente, Sim Bloco 2. Construção de tensão. 900 palavras. Thomas Whitmore had guided me through complex negotiations, handled intricate legal structures, celebrated with me when the deal closed. He knew my business background intimately. He knew my financial acumen. He knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of achieving. And now he was helping Brandon draft documents designed to ensure I walked away from our marriage with absolutely nothing. The betrayal was so complete, so thorough, that I actually laughed. It was a strange, hollow sound in that quiet office. I stood there holding papers proving my husband was preparing to discard me after systematically destroying my career and stealing my money. The room felt too bright suddenly, every detail sharp and clear. I could see dust motes floating in afternoon sunlight coming through windows. I could hear Brandon's voice still droning downstairs about quarterly projections and market expansion. I could smell the leather of his ridiculous executive chair, and I understood, with absolute crystalline certainty, that I had been living in a carefully constructed trap for 3 years. Brandon hadn't loved me. He had used me. He had identified exactly what he needed, my money and initial business connections, and he had systematically extracted everything of value while reducing me to irrelevance. Looking back now, I can see how carefully Brandon had orchestrated my disappearance. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, methodical, like watching someone slowly turn down a dimmer switch until you're standing in darkness, wondering when the light went out. The first incident happened 2 months after our wedding. We attended a tech industry mixer in downtown Seattle, the kind of event I used to attend as featured speaker. An old colleague, Marcus Chen, approached us with genuine enthusiasm. He asked what I was working on, clearly expecting to hear about my next venture. Before I could respond, Brandon's hand tightened on my waist, and he said I was taking time to focus on our marriage. That building strong foundation at home was more important than chasing professional validation. Marcus looked confused, glanced at me for confirmation, but Brandon was already steering us toward another conversation. I felt my face flush hot with embarrassment, my throat closing around words I couldn't figure out how to say. The second time, Brandon edited my bio for a charity gala. The original draft I wrote mentioned my background in technology and finance. The version that went to print described me as Brandon Ashford's wife, supporter of various causes, enthusiastic home chef. When I confronted him, he said my version sounded like I was trying too hard, that people would think I was compensating for insecurity. He made it sound so reasonable, like he was protecting me from embarrassment. I actually thanked him. That's what kills me now. I thanked him for erasing me. The third incident was more subtle, but somehow worse. We were having dinner with potential investors, and conversation turned to market analysis. I mentioned an observation about emerging patterns in commercial real estate, technology, something I had been studying for months. Brandon laughed, actually laughed, and told everyone I had been reading his industry reports and thought I understood the complexity. He patted my hand like I was a child who had said something adorable, but fundamentally misguided. The investors smiled politely and changed the subject. I sat there feeling my expertise, my education, my entire professional identity crumbling into something quaint and irrelevant. My hands trembled in my lap. My chest felt tight. I excused myself to the bathroom and stared at my reflection, wondering who the hell I was becoming. But I told myself I was being sensitive, that Brandon didn't mean anything by it, that marriage required compromise, and maybe I needed to let go of my ego about always being the expert in the room. I actually believed that for a while. I convinced myself that supporting Brandon's success was its own kind of achievement, that there was nobility in stepping back, so someone else could shine. The pattern continued for months. Every time I demonstrated knowledge or competence, Brandon found ways to undermine it. When I suggested improvements to his company's financial structure, he told me I didn't understand how real businesses operated. When I offered to review his pitch deck before investor meetings, he said my feedback was too theoretical, that I had been out of the industry too long to understand current dynamics. When I mentioned missing my work, he reminded me that I had chosen to step away, that nobody forced me, that perhaps I just wasn't cut out for the pressure of running a company if I gave it up so easily. That last comment landed like a physical blow. My stomach dropped. I felt dizzy, because there was just enough truth in it to make me question everything. I had chosen to step away. I had transferred my money into our joint account. I had agreed to focus on supporting his venture instead of pursuing my own. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just looking for someone to blame for my own choices. Except, here's what I didn't see then, but understand perfectly now. Those weren't really my choices. They were choices I made based on information Brandon carefully controlled, promises he systematically broke, and reality he meticulously constructed to serve his purposes. I gave up my career because he promised we were building something together. I transferred my money because he said it was our shared investment. I stepped back because he assured me I would be his full partner, just behind the scenes where my skills would be more valuable. Every single decision I made was based on lies he told so convincingly that I never thought to question them. Esse capítulo de 900 palavras ficou bom para você? Quer que eu siga para o próximo? Tentar novamente. Zin bloco 3. Primeira reviravolta. 900 palavras. I sat down in Brandon's leather chair, the one he never let me use, because it was his special ergonomic throne or whatever masculine nonsense he had claimed, and I pulled out my phone with hands that had stopped shaking. The trembling had been replaced by something else, something cold and focused that felt almost like stepping outside my own body and watching myself from a distance. I dialed Thomas Whitmore's office number from memory. His assistant answered, professional and efficient, and I asked to speak with Thomas directly. She said he was in a meeting. I told her to interrupt it, that this was Claire Mercer calling, about urgent business regarding Brandon Ashford. There was a pause, some muffled conversation in the background, and then Thomas's voice came through the line. He sounded genuinely surprised, warmly so, like hearing from an old friend he had lost touch with. He said my name with that familiar enthusiasm, asked how I had been, mentioned it had been too long since we had spoken. The casual friendliness of his tone made what I was about to say even more surreal. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I told him I was sitting in my husband's office looking at a prenuptial agreement amendment he had drafted, one I had never seen or signed, one that systematically excluded me from any claim to a company I had helped fund. The silence that followed was long and heavy. I could hear Thomas breathing, could almost feel him recalibrating, trying to figure out how to handle this conversation. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. The warmth was gone, replaced by careful, professional neutrality. He said he couldn't discuss client matters, that I must understand his position, that attorney-client privilege prevented him from commenting. I cut him off. I told him I understood privilege just fine, that I wasn't asking him to violate it, but I had a simple factual question that he could answer as my former attorney rather than Brandon's current one. There was another pause, shorter this time, and then he asked what I wanted to know. I asked if he remembered representing me 4 years ago during the sale of my second startup. He said of course he did, that it had been one of his favorite deals to work on, that I had been exceptionally prepared and professional throughout the process. I asked if he remembered the final sale price. He confirmed it was $670,000. I asked if he remembered me mentioning, during our final meeting, that I had met someone I was getting serious with, someone named Brandon Ashford who was planning to start a commercial real estate software company. There was a very long silence this time. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said he remembered that conversation. He remembered me being excited about combining my business experience with Brandon's industry connections. He remembered me asking general questions about partnership structures and joint ventures. Then Thomas said something that made my entire body go rigid. He said that 6 months after that conversation, Brandon had come to him asking for help structuring his new company. Thomas had asked how Brandon had gotten his contact information, and Brandon had mentioned his wife Claire had recommended him, that I had told him Thomas was the best business attorney I had ever worked with. Thomas had assumed we had gotten married, had been pleased that I had referred business to him, had never thought to question anything about the arrangement. His voice got quieter as he continued. He said he had asked Brandon about my involvement in the company, whether I would be listed as co-founder or partner. Brandon had laughed and said no, that I had decided to step away from business to focus on domestic life, that I was happy to support him from the sidelines. Thomas said he had found that surprising given my drive and competence, but people make different choices in relationships, and it wasn't his place to question. Then, his voice changed again, taking on an edge I had never heard before. He asked me a question that made my blood freeze in my veins. He asked if I knew that Brandon had used my money as his initial capital investment. My mouth went completely dry. I managed to ask what he meant by that. Thomas explained, slowly and carefully, that when Brandon had come to him to structure the company, he had brought $200,000 in startup capital. Thomas had asked about the source of the funds, because proper documentation was essential for the corporate structure. Brandon had explained that his wife, meaning me, had transferred money from her business accounts into their joint account to support the launch. Thomas had drafted documents showing Brandon as sole founder with $200,000 in initial capital investment. He had never thought to verify whose money it actually was, or whether I had been properly documented as an investor. Why would he? Brandon had presented it as his money, and Thomas had no reason to question his client's statements about his own financial situation. But now, hearing me on the phone, clearly unaware of how my own money had been used, Thomas was putting pieces together that formed a very disturbing picture. He asked me directly if I had known my money was being used to fund Brandon's company. I told him no, that Brandon had told me we were making investments together, that it was our shared future, that my name would be on everything alongside his. Thomas made a sound that was half groan, half cursey. He said one word, quietly, but with absolute conviction. He said fraud. My heart was hammering now, so hard I could feel it in my throat. I asked him to explain. Esse capítulo de 900 palavras ficou bom para você? Quer que eu siga para o próximo? Tentar novamente. Diz em bloco 4. Subtramas e complicações. 900 palavras. Thomas's voice shifted into lawyer mode, precise and careful. He explained that if Brandon had misrepresented how my money would be used, if he had promised joint ownership while actually structuring everything in his name alone, if he had deliberately concealed my financial contribution from the corporate structure, then we were potentially looking at fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and several other legal issues. He said the fact that Brandon had come to him, my former attorney, made it even more problematic, because Brandon would have known Thomas wouldn't question the arrangement given our prior professional relationship. It suggested premeditation, careful planning, deliberate manipulation of circumstances to serve Brandon's interests while excluding mine. Thomas asked if I still had records of the money transfer. I told him I had records of everything, that I had always been meticulous about financial documentation, that 3 years of bank statements and emails and text messages were backed up in multiple locations, because that's just how my brain works. Thomas was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that changed everything. He said that based on what I had just told him, I wasn't just Brandon's wife in a bad marriage. I was potentially an undocumented founding investor in a company that Brandon had fraudulently structured to exclude me. He explained that Washington state had specific laws about marital property and business ownership. He explained that the corporate structure Brandon had created was actually full of holes, rushed and sloppy, in ways that suggested Brandon had been more concerned with speed than proper legal protection. He explained that if I could prove my financial contribution and Brandon's misrepresentation, I could potentially claim significant ownership in the company, regardless of whose name was on the founding documents. My mind was racing, making connections, seeing patterns I had missed before. I asked Thomas what I should do next. He said he couldn't advise me, that representing me would create a massive conflict of interest with his representation of Brandon, but he could refer me to someone who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. He gave me a name, Jennifer Walsh, a forensic attorney who had built her career untangling complex financial fraud cases. He said he would call her immediately, brief her on the basics, and she would be expecting my call within the hour. Then his voice softened slightly, became personal again. He said he was sorry, that he should have asked more questions 3 years ago, that he had allowed himself to take Brandon's statements at face value without verifying anything. After I hung up, I sat in that office for a long time, just breathing, just thinking, just letting the full scope of what I had discovered settle into my bones. Brandon hadn't just dismissed me, or undermined me, or made me feel small. He had systematically stolen from me. He had taken my money, my connections, my professional reputation, and he had used all of it to build something he claimed as entirely his own. And now he was preparing to divorce me, leave me with nothing, while keeping everything he had built on the foundation of my demolished career. The prenuptial amendment sitting on the desk in front of me wasn't just cruel. It was the final piece of a plan he had been executing for 3 years. A plan to extract everything valuable from me, and then discard me like I had never mattered at all. I thought about all the times he had made me feel stupid, incompetent, too sensitive, too ambitious, too much of everything except what he needed me to be. I thought about Helen Ashford suggesting volunteer work. I thought about Christmas presents that reduced me to hobbies and domesticity. I thought about standing in that conference room this morning, invisible, while Brandon told his partners I wasn't even close to his level. Jennifer Walsh's office was in a sleek building downtown, all glass and steel that reflected the gray Seattle sky like a mirror. I met with her 2 days after my conversation with Thomas. 2 days I spent maintaining my usual invisible routine, while my mind worked through possibilities and implications, like a computer processing complex algorithms. Jennifer was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed and direct, in a way that reminded me of who I used to be before Brandon. She had reviewed the preliminary information Thomas sent over, and she got straight to business. She asked me to walk her through everything, starting from the beginning, and to be brutally honest about my own role in how things had unfolded. That last part surprised me. Most people, when they hear stories like mine, want to paint you as a pure victim. Jennifer wanted the complicated truth, so I told her. I told her about meeting Brandon, about being genuinely attracted to his vision and charisma, about making the conscious choice to step back from my own work because I believed we were building something together. I told her about transferring the money, about dissolving my consulting practice, about all the small decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but now looked like steps in someone else's carefully planned trap. Jennifer listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad in handwriting so precise it looked like font. When I finished, she asked a question that made me pause. She asked if I had ever suspected anything was wrong before finding that prenup amendment. I thought about lying, about saying no, about making myself seem less complicit in my own erasure, but something about Jennifer's steady gaze made me tell the truth. Esse capítulo de 900 palavras ficou bom para você? Quer que eu siga para o próximo? Tentar novamente, diz em bloco 5. Entrelaçamento de tramas. 900 palavras. I said yes, that I had felt something shifting, that the constant undermining and dismissal had accumulated into this background noise of wrongness that I kept trying to ignore. I said I had convinced myself I was being oversensitive, that I was struggling with the adjustment to a different kind of life, that maybe I just wasn't cut out for being supportive instead of leading. I said I had gaslit myself as effectively as Brandon had gaslit me, maybe more so, because I knew better, and I did it anyway. Jennifer nodded like I had said exactly what she expected. She told me that was actually good, that it meant I was being honest about the complexity of the situation, and that honesty would be essential moving forward. Then she asked for access to everything, every bank statement, every email, every text message, every document related to Brandon's company. She said she needed to bring in a forensic accountant to trace exactly how my money had moved through various accounts, and whether Brandon had properly disclosed the source of his initial capital to other investors. She said if he had misrepresented his funding sources, that opened up additional legal issues beyond just fraud against me. Other investors might have claims as well. The company's entire financial foundation might be built on misrepresentation. Over the next 3 weeks, I lived a strange double life. During the day, I was the same invisible Claire Brandon expected me to be. I served coffee at his meetings. I organized dinner parties. I smiled politely when Helen Ashford made comments about my lack of purpose. But every moment Brandon was out of the house, I was working. I was gathering 3 years of documentation, organizing everything into detailed spreadsheets, creating a timeline of every financial transaction. and every promise Brandon had made and broken. I was meeting with Jennifer and her team, walking them through my business background, and explaining the technology sector context they needed to understand the full scope of what Brandon had built. I was discovering muscles I had forgotten I had, skills I had let atrophy, the part of myself that knew how to build cases and construct arguments and see 3 moves ahead. It felt like coming back to life after years of sleepwalking, but it also felt terrifying because I kept waiting for Brandon to notice, to see that something had changed in me, to realize I wasn't quite as invisible as he needed me to be. He never did. That was almost the most insulting part. I was preparing to potentially destroy his entire world, and he was so confident in my irrelevance that he never even looked closely enough to see what was happening right in front of him. The forensic accountant Jennifer brought in was a woman named Diana Reeves, and she was extraordinary. She traced my $200,000 through the joint account into Brandon's business account, and then into various corporate structures. She found that Brandon had indeed misrepresented the source of his initial capital to other investors, claiming it was from personal savings and family loans rather than from his wife's business earnings. She found irregular transfers from corporate accounts to personal accounts that Brandon controlled. She found vendor payments to companies that didn't seem to exist or were registered to members of Brandon's family. The more Diana dug, the worse it got. Brandon hadn't just used my money to start his company. He had been systematically looting it for personal expenses while maintaining appearances of legitimate business operations. He was preparing to claim the company was struggling financially as justification for the prenup amendment and eventual divorce, when in reality the company was doing reasonably well, but he had been siphoning money into hidden accounts. It was fraud on multiple levels, affecting multiple parties, way beyond just a bad marriage. Jennifer said we had several options for how to proceed. We could file civil suits for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. We could report the financial irregularities to the State Business Commission. We could approach Brandon directly and negotiate a settlement, or we could take a different approach entirely. She asked me what I actually wanted, not legally, not strategically, but emotionally, personally. What did I want the outcome to be? I thought about that question for a long time. I thought about Brandon's face when he laughed at me in front of those investors. I thought about years of carefully constructed diminishment. I thought about the prenup amendment, designed to leave me with nothing. I thought about Helen Ashford's pitying suggestions about volunteer work. I thought about Christmas presents of gardening books. I thought about standing in that conference room being told I wasn't even close to Brandon's level. And I realized what I wanted wasn't just money, or vindication, or even justice in the legal sense. What I wanted was for everyone who had watched me disappear to see exactly who I had been all along. I wanted Brandon to understand, truly understand, that he had never been the genius he believed himself to be, that everything he had built was constructed on the foundation of my demolished career. Jennifer smiled when I told her this. She said that was exactly the kind of clarity she needed. Then she asked if I would be willing to do something risky, something that required patience and perfect timing, and the ability to maintain my current role while preparing for a very public confrontation. I asked what she had in mind. Jennifer explained that Brandon's company was structured as a closely held corporation, with himself as majority shareholder and several outside investors holding minority positions. The investors included Richard Morrison and James Caldwell, the man who had been in that conference room with Brandon when he had dismissed me. Esse capítulo de 900 palavras ficou bom para você? Quer que eu siga para o próximo? Tentar novamente bloco 6. Crise crescent. 900 palavras. Jennifer had researched both Richard and James thoroughly. Richard was a prominent venture capitalist who had built his reputation on backing innovative companies. James was a tech industry veteran who had sold his own company for significant money 5 years ago. Both men prided themselves on backing solid business fundamentals and ethical leadership. Both men would be extremely concerned to learn that the company they had invested in was built on fraud and ongoing financial misrepresentation. Jennifer suggested we approach Richard and James privately, present them with the evidence Diana had compiled, and offer them a choice. They could support Brandon and risk their own reputations and potentially face liability for investing in a fraudulently structured company, or they could work with us to remove Brandon and restructure the company properly. She said, given the evidence we had, most investors in their position would cut their losses and side with whoever gave them the cleanest exit. And if that person was me, if I could demonstrate both the legal claim and the business competence to actually run the company, They might see it as an opportunity rather than a crisis. The plan was audacious and risky and required me to essentially gamble everything on the belief that I could convince two men who had watched me serve coffee that I was actually capable of running a multi-million-dollar company. But something about the challenge appealed to me. Maybe it was ego. Maybe it was the desire to prove myself in the most dramatic way possible. Maybe it was just that I was tired of being careful and small and invisible. I told Jennifer to set up the meetings. She scheduled them for the following week. Separate conversations with Richard and James where I would present my case without Brandon's knowledge. In the meantime, I had to keep playing my role perfectly. I had to keep being the dismissible wife while preparing to demonstrate that I was actually the most competent person in the entire situation. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. I served coffee at Brandon's next investor meeting, while knowing I would be meeting with those same investors privately within days. I smiled at Helen Ashford during Sunday brunch, while knowing her son's entire empire was about to crumble. I listened to Brandon talk about his vision for the company's future, while knowing he wouldn't have a future in that company at all. But underneath the performance, I was also struggling with something else. Doubt. Real, visceral doubt about whether I could actually pull this off. 3 years away from business. 3 years of being systematically diminished. 3 years of accepting a smaller version of myself had left marks I couldn't just erase with documentation and legal arguments. I woke up at 3 a.m. wondering if I was being ridiculous, if I was overreaching, if maybe Brandon had been right that I wasn't cut out for this level of business after all. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone who had let herself be erased, and I wondered if that person could really transform back into someone formidable. Jennifer must have sensed my uncertainty during one of our preparation meetings. She asked me directly if I was having doubts. I told her yes, that I was terrified I would get in front of Richard and James and fall apart, that they would see right through me to the uncertain, diminished person I had become. Jennifer set down her pen and looked at me for a long moment. Then she asked me to describe exactly what I had accomplished before meeting Brandon. So I did. I walked her through building 2 companies from nothing, through identifying market gaps and creating solutions, through negotiating deals and managing teams and handling the 1,000 daily challenges of entrepreneurship. Jennifer listened, and then she asked me one more question. She asked if Brandon could have done any of that. The answer was so obvious it was almost funny. No, Brandon couldn't have done any of that. Brandon was good at sales and networking, at creating enthusiasm and excitement, at getting people to believe in possibilities, but the actual work of building companies, the strategic thinking and financial management and operational excellence that my businesses had required, those weren't skills Brandon possessed at all. That's why he had needed me. That's why he had worked so hard to access my money and connections while keeping me too diminished to realize what he was doing. He had been threatened by my competence from the beginning, and his entire strategy had been built around extracting what he needed, while neutralizing the threat I represented. Jennifer told me to remember that. She told me that the woman who had built 2 successful companies was still in there underneath 3 years of gaslighting and manipulation. I went home that night and pulled out old files from my storage unit, folders I hadn't looked at in 3 years, pitch decks from my startups, business plans I had written, press coverage from my company sales, awards I had won, evidence of who I had been before Brandon convinced me to disappear, and I felt something shift inside me again. Something harder and clearer than the cold clarity I had felt finding that prenup amendment. I felt like myself again. Finally. The meeting with Richard Morrison happened on a Thursday afternoon at a neutral location, a private room in a downtown hotel that Jennifer had reserved under her firm's name. Richard arrived exactly on time, dressed in expensive casual wear that venture capitalists favor, looking curious but also slightly annoyed at the mysterious nature of the meeting request. Esse capítulo de 900 palavras ficou bom para você? Quer que eu siga para o próximo? Tentar novamente. De sim, bloco 7. Tensão máxima. 900 palavras. Jennifer had told him only that there were urgent matters regarding his investment in Brandon's company that required confidential discussion. I watched him walk into the room, watched his expression shift from professional curiosity to genuine surprise when he saw me sitting at the conference table with Jennifer and Diana. He said, my name like a question, like he was trying to figure out why Brandon's wife would be involved in a meeting about business matters. I gestured to the empty chair across from us and told him to sit down, that what we needed to discuss would take some time, and he would want to be sitting for it. Something in my tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because he sat without any of the casual confidence he had displayed walking in. Jennifer started the presentation, walking Richard through the legal framework first, explaining the implications of what we had discovered in clear, precise language. Then Diana took over, presenting the forensic analysis of the company's financial structure and the irregularities she had found. I watched Richard's face as he processed the information, watched him go from skeptical to concerned, to genuinely alarmed as Diana showed him evidence of the misrepresented capital sources, the hidden transfers, the vendor payments to shell companies. His jaw tightened when Diana explained that Brandon had told investors his initial capital came from personal savings and family loans, when in fact it had come from his wife's business earnings, from me, with no proper documentation of my investment or ownership stake. Richard asked if Brandon knew we were having this meeting. Jennifer told him no, that we had approached him and James first because they were the primary outside investors, and because their response would determine how we proceeded. Richard leaned back in his chair and was quiet for almost a full minute, just thinking, processing, calculating. I could practically see him running scenarios in his head, figuring out angles, assessing damage to his reputation and portfolio. Then, he looked directly at me for the first time since the presentation started. He asked me what I wanted, not what my lawyers wanted, not what would happen legally, but what outcome I personally was seeking. I told him I wanted what was rightfully mine. I wanted recognition of my founding investment and corresponding ownership stake in the company. I wanted Brandon removed from operational control, given his clear pattern of financial fraud and misrepresentation. And I wanted the opportunity to run the company myself, to implement the strategies I had been watching Brandon ignore for 3 years, to prove that the person they had all dismissed as just a wife was actually the most competent operator in the entire situation. Richard's eyebrows went up at that last part. He asked, not unkindly but definitely skeptically, what made me think I could run a commercial real estate software company. So I told him. I walked him through my background, my 2 previous startups, my MBA in finance, my years of experience in technology and business operations. I pulled out my old pitch decks and business plans, physical evidence of competence that I had brought specifically for this moment. I explained the strategic mistakes I had watched Brandon make, the opportunities he had missed, the ways the company could be optimized with proper leadership. I spoke for 20 minutes without notes, without hesitation, in the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about, because she had done it before, and could absolutely do it again. When I finished, Richard was looking at me completely differently. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something that looked like reassessment, like he was recalculating everything. He thought he knew about this situation. He asked why I had stepped away from business in the first place, if I was as capable as I was claiming. I told him the truth. I said I had fallen in love with someone who promised we would build something together, who convinced me that my skills would be more valuable supporting his vision than pursuing my own separate path, who systematically extracted everything I had to offer, while ensuring I would never have any official claim to what we built. Richard nodded slowly, and I could see him fitting pieces together in his mind. He asked about James Caldwell, whether we had approached him yet. Jennifer said we had a meeting scheduled with James the following day, that we wanted to give both primary investors the same information and the same opportunity to respond appropriately. Richard asked what would happen if he and James didn't cooperate, if they sided with Brandon instead. Diana answered that one. She said they would face potential liability for continuing to invest in a company with fraudulent financial foundations, that they would likely be named in civil suits alongside Brandon, and that their reputations in the investment community would suffer regardless of legal outcomes once the full scope of the situation became public. She said it matter-of-factly, not as a threat, but as a statement of inevitable consequences. Richard asked for time to think, to review the documentation more carefully, to consult his own attorneys. Jennifer told him he had 48 hours before we approached the State Business Commission with the financial irregularities Diana had found. She said we were offering him and James the opportunity to be part of the solution, rather than part of the problem, but that opportunity had a limited window. Richard stood up, gathered the copies of documents we had provided, and paused at the door. He turned back and asked me one more question. He asked if I had really been the one serving coffee at that meeting 3 weeks ago when Brandon had said I wasn't even close to his level. I told him yes, that I had been standing right there, invisible as always, collecting cups while my husband dismissed me to the men who had invested in a company built with my money. Esse capítulo de 900 palavras ficou bom para você? Quer que eu siga para o próximo? Tentar novamente. Sim, bloco 8. Clímax e revelação máxima. 900 palavras. Richard shook his head slowly, and I couldn't quite read his expression. Then he said something unexpected. He said he was sorry, that he should have asked more questions, that he had allowed himself to accept Brandon's narrative about his dismissible wife without ever wondering if there might be more to the story. He said that was a failure of due diligence on his part, and he had learned an important lesson about assumptions. Then he left, and I sat there feeling oddly drained, like I had just run a marathon while standing still. The meeting with James. Caldwell the next day followed a similar pattern, but with some interesting differences. James was older than Richard, more experienced, and he caught on to the implications faster. He asked harder questions about the forensic accounting, pushing Diana to explain her methodology and sources. He wanted to understand exactly how certain we were about Brandon's misrepresentations because, as he pointed out, making accusations like this could destroy Brandon's career and reputation, even if some details turned out to be less clear-cut than we believed. I appreciated that he was being thorough rather than just reactive. It suggested he was someone who thought carefully about consequences and wanted to be sure before taking action. Over the weekend, I waited for Richard and James to make their decision. Brandon was home most of the time, working in his office, occasionally emerging to complain about various business pressures or demand that I handle some domestic task. The cognitive dissonance of serving him dinner while knowing his entire world was about to collapse was surreal. I kept thinking he would notice something different about me, some subtle shift in energy or demeanor that would tip him off that I wasn't the invisible wife he thought I was anymore. But he never looked closely enough to see anything. On Sunday afternoon, while Brandon was on a call in his office, my phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. Richard and James had conferred, reviewed the documentation with their attorneys, and made a decision. They wanted to meet with all of us Monday morning to discuss next steps for removing Brandon and restructuring the company with me as CEO. They wanted to move quickly to minimize damage once the situation became known. They were prepared to support me fully in taking over operations, with the understanding that I would be subject to the same accountability and performance standards they would hold any CEO to. Jennifer said they had also insisted on one additional condition. They wanted to be present when we confronted Brandon, when we told him what was happening and why. They wanted to deliver the message personally that his investors were withdrawing support, and they wanted to see his response themselves rather than hearing about it secondhand. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that Seattle specializes in. Rain that wasn't quite rain but wasn't quite mist either, just dampness that settled into everything. I got up at 5:30 like always, made Brandon's coffee like always, listened to him complain about traffic and upcoming meetings like always. The routine was so familiar it felt almost comforting, except now I knew it was the last morning things would ever be normal in this way. I wore a navy suit I had bought 3 years ago for business meetings I had stopped having, paired it with heels I had forgotten I owned. When Brandon saw me coming downstairs dressed like that, he actually looked surprised. He asked where I was going, what the occasion was, his tone carrying that familiar edge of condescension like he couldn't imagine I would have anywhere important to be. I told him I had a meeting downtown, nothing he needed to worry about. He laughed and said something about book club getting fancy these days. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock at Jennifer's office. Brandon had a lunch meeting with potential clients that would run until 1:30, giving us 30 minutes to get him to Jennifer's office under the pretense of an urgent investor meeting that Richard had requested. At 1:45, Jennifer got a text from her assistant that Brandon had arrived in the building. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. Richard and James took their positions at the conference table, sitting on one side with Jennifer and Diana. I stood by the windows, partially turned away, giving Brandon a moment to enter the room and see the setup before he saw me. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, heard him greeting Jennifer's assistant with that false warmth he used with service workers, heard the conference room door open. There was a beat of silence as Brandon took in the scene, his 2 primary investors sitting with 2 attorneys and stacks of documentation spread across the table, all of them looking at him with expressions that weren't friendly. He said Richard's name as a question, asked what this was about, why Jennifer was involved, his voice trying for casual but landing somewhere closer to nervous. Richard told him to sit down. Brandon said he preferred to stand, that he had another meeting to get to. Could they make this quick? Richard repeated, more firmly, that Brandon should sit down because what they needed to discuss was going to take some time. That's when Brandon's eyes found me by the windows. I watched his face shift through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, confusion, irritation, and finally, something that might have been the first stirring of real concern. He asked what I was doing there, why his wife was at a business meeting, his tone suggesting the absurdity of my presence. I turned to face him fully and spoke for the first time. I told him to sit down, Brandon, that he was going to want to be sitting for this conversation. Esse capítulo de 900 palavras ficou bom para você? Quer que eu siga para o próximo? Tentar novamente, G-Sim bloco 9. Resolução e conclusão, 900 palavras. Something in my voice must have been different enough to register, because he actually did sit, slowly, his eyes moving between me and the others trying to calculate what was happening. Jennifer started the presentation, her voice cool and professional as she outlined the legal issues we had uncovered: misrepresentation of capital sources, undocumented founding investment, fraudulent corporate structure, ongoing financial irregularities. I watched Brandon's face as he processed what she was saying, watched him go from confused to defensive to calculating. He interrupted her multiple times, trying to redirect, trying to control the narrative, saying there must be some misunderstanding, that his attorneys had handled everything properly, that he didn't know what Jennifer thought she had found, but clearly there were errors in her analysis. Jennifer just kept talking, methodically presenting each piece of evidence, not engaging with his deflections. When she finished, Diana took over. With the forensic accounting presentation, she showed him the trace transactions, the money trail from my business accounts through our joint account into his company, the payments to shell companies, the offshore transfers. Brandon's face was getting red now, that flush that started at his neck and worked upward when he was angry or threatened. Then I started my presentation. I walked Brandon through my background, my previous companies, my MBA in finance, all the qualifications he had spent. 3 years getting everyone to forget. I showed him the strategic plan I had developed for running his company, the one that addressed all the opportunities he had missed and mistakes he had made. I presented financial projections showing exactly how the company could be optimized under competent leadership. I spoke for 15 minutes without notes, in the voice of someone who absolutely knew what she was talking about, and I watched Brandon's face shift from dismissive to shocked, to something approaching panic as he realized I wasn't the person he thought I was anymore. When I finished, Richard spoke. He told Brandon that he and James had reviewed all the evidence, consulted with their own attorneys, and made a decision. They were exercising their rights under the investor agreement to call for removal of the CEO due to breach of fiduciary duty and financial misrepresentation. They were supporting me as Brandon's replacement. The transition would happen immediately. Brandon's access to company accounts and systems would be revoked by end of business day. He would retain a minority ownership stake according to what the forensic accounting determined was fair given the actual capital contributions, but he would have no operational role going forward. Brandon sat there in stunned silence for a long moment. Then he tried one last manipulation, the nuclear option he had been holding in reserve. He looked at me and said I was making a huge mistake, that I clearly didn't understand what I was getting into, that I would fail and embarrass myself and prove he had been right all along about my limitations. He said I should really think carefully about whether I wanted everyone to see me fail publicly, whether my ego was worth that humiliation. It was such a transparent attempt to trigger my insecurities that it was almost pathetic. I looked at him and felt something I had never felt toward Brandon before: pity. I told him I had already thought very carefully about everything, probably more carefully than he had ever thought about anything in his entire life, and I was completely comfortable with my decision. 6 months after officially becoming CEO, I sat in my office on the 23rd floor looking out at the gray Seattle afternoon and thinking about how completely my life had transformed. Mercer Technologies had just closed the most profitable quarter in the company's history, with revenue growth of 47% year-over-year in customer satisfaction scores that exceeded industry benchmarks. Brandon had essentially disappeared from the Seattle tech scene. Last I heard, he had moved to Portland and was working in commercial real estate sales, a considerable step down from CEO of a technology company. I felt nothing when I heard that news. No satisfaction or vindication, or even residual anger. Brandon had simply become irrelevant to my life, a footnote in my history, rather than the defining character I had let him be for too long. The divorce had been finalized 4 months ago, in a brief court hearing that felt anticlimactic, given everything that had led to that moment. I had bought a modern condo downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and clean lines and no history, except what I would create going forward. One wall of my home office displayed awards from my previous companies, alongside recent recognition for Mercer Technologies' performance. Looking at that wall helped me remember I had always been capable, that 3 years with Brandon hadn't erased my fundamental competence, even when it had felt like he had destroyed everything I was. If I could offer anything to other women going through similar situations, women who have been systematically diminished by partners who benefit from their silence and compliance, it would be this: your competence is real. Whatever skills and intelligence and capabilities you possessed before someone convinced you to be small, those things still exist inside you. They can be recovered and rebuilt and wielded again, even after years of suppression. It won't be easy, but it's possible. I know because I did it, and I wasn't exceptional or uniquely strong. I was just someone who got angry enough to stop accepting diminishment and started fighting to reclaim what had been stolen. Standing in my office that afternoon, I thought about the woman I had been 6 months ago serving coffee, while her husband told investors she wasn't even close to his level. That woman would be proud of who I had become, and she would tell me, if she could, that she had always known I was capable of this. She had just been waiting for me to remember. Subscribe to hear more stories like mine, because sometimes the invisible wife was actually the genius all along.